A single lump of dried human waste, pulled from the dirt floor of an Oregon cave, has forced scientists to tear up the textbook explanation of how humans first reached America. Not a spear point. Not a skull. Waste. And yet inside it was a genetic signature so precise, so undeniable, that it pushed back the arrival of people on this continent by more than 1,000 years beyond what generations of archaeologists had insisted was the absolute earliest possible date. This is the story of how a scatter of caves in south-central Oregon, followed by a wind-scoured rock shelter 70 miles away, became the crack that split open one of the most stubbornly defended theories in American science. The caves are called the Paisley Caves, a set of dry rock shelters carved into the high desert of south-central Oregon. Archaeologists from the University of Oregon had known about the site for decades before anyone dug deep enough to understand what was underneath it. When researchers led by Dennis Jenkins finally excavated down through the cave floor in the early 2000s, they recovered coprolites, preserved human fecal material, hardened and intact after thousands of years in the dry desert air. It sounds unglamorous, almost embarrassing, next to the dramatic image of a carved spear point catching the light in a museum case. But coprolites carry something stone tools never can: biological material. DNA. And when the team extracted and sequenced the mitochondrial DNA from those samples, the results matched the founding haplogroups A2 and B2, the same genetic lines carried by indigenous peoples living across the Americas today. This was not evidence of some failed migration that arrived, struggled, and died out. It was a direct genetic thread connecting a person who sheltered in that cave to families alive right now. The dating method used was accelerator mass spectrometry, which measures the age of the organic material itself rather than the surrounding soil. That distinction mattered enormously, because the usual objections to an unexpectedly old find center on the possibility that an object slipped down through the layers, or that the surrounding sediment got disturbed and mixed. Dating the coprolites directly cut past those objections entirely. The calibrated results came back at more than 14,000 years before present, at least 1,000 years earlier than the arrival window assigned to the people long credited as the first Americans. For most of the 20th century, that credit belonged to the Clovis culture, named for the fluted spear points first identified near Clovis, New Mexico, in the 1930s. The accepted story held that a single group crossed a frozen land bridge from Siberia into Alaska around 13,000 years ago, found a gap in the retreating ice sheets, and spread across a continent that had never known a human footprint. It was a clean narrative. It fit neatly into a single classroom diagram, one arrow sweeping from Asia down into the Americas. It also anchored entire academic careers, entire museum exhibits, entire generations of training. Which is precisely why the Paisley Caves findings, when published, were met not with celebration but with suspicion. Extraordinary dates, in this field, have always been treated as extraordinarily dangerous to the people who report them. 70 miles from Paisley, a second Oregon site would turn that suspicion into something far harder to dismiss. Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter, near the small town of Riley in Harney County, had been under excavation since 2011. Led by University of Oregon archaeologist Patrick O'Grady. For years the site gave up almost nothing dramatic, just scattered obsidian flakes and a handful of ground stone tools. Then O'Grady's team identified something the Paisley Caves never had: a hard geological boundary. Buried in the sediment was a distinct layer of volcanic ash, chemically matched to a known eruption of Mount St. Helens dated to roughly 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. That ash layer functioned like a lid sealed over time itself. Anything found beneath it had to be older than the eruption, full stop. No argument about disturbed layers or shifted sediment could explain away a marker laid down by a volcano 1,000 miles distant. Beneath that ash, the team recovered 27 fragments of tooth enamel belonging to two extinct Ice Age species: yesterday's camel and bison antiquus, an ancestor of the modern American bison, both long vanished from the continent. And roughly 10 centimeters deeper than those teeth, meaning older still, they found a single stone tool worked from orange chalcedony, a glassy variety of agate. It combined a curved cutting edge, a flat scraping edge, and a serrated edge worn smooth from what O'Grady has described as a lifetime of use, the kind of gradual polish that only develops from years of handling, sharpening, and resharpening. This was not a discarded flake. It was a tool someone carried, relied on, and eventually left behind in that shelter. When the lab dated the animal teeth above the tool, the results came back between roughly 21,000 to 22,000 years old. O'Grady, by his own account, did not trust the number and ordered a second, independent test. It returned the same window. 2 samples, 2 separate analyses, 1 unavoidable conclusion. A person had been standing in that shelter, tool in hand, more than 18,000 years before the Clovis culture was ever supposed to exist. And the tool itself did not belong to the Clovis tradition at all. Its shape, its long blade, its rounded base, place it instead within what archaeologists call the Western stem tradition, a distinct tool-making style that predates Clovis by thousands of years and bears no resemblance to it. A separate tradition that, old, with its own techniques and its own logic, cannot have descended from a culture that had not yet come into existence. It implies an entirely different population, with its own history, already present on the land. Oregon was not the first place this argument had been made, and it is worth remembering the archaeologist who made it first and paid for it. Decades earlier, in southwestern Pennsylvania, a sandstone overhang known as Meadowcroft Rock Shelter became the site of one of the longest and most contentious digs in North American archaeology. Excavations led by James Adavaggio beginning in 1973 pushed the human occupation layers down further than anyone expected, and the radiocarbon dates that came back placed people at Meadowcroft as early as 16,000 to 19,000 calibrated years ago. Adavaggio published the findings in American Antiquity in 1980, stating plainly that the Clovis First model could not be correct. The response from much of the field was not engagement but dismissal. Some colleagues suggested contamination. Others simply declined to address the paper at all. Researchers later coined a phrase for the phenomenon, describing the entrenched resistance as Clovis primacy syndrome, a defense of the old model that persisted long after the evidence against it had accumulated. Even decades later, surveys of working archaeologists found only a minority fully accepted Adavaggio's dates, a striking gap for a finding that has held up under repeated scrutiny for more than 40 years. Adavaggio absorbed that resistance largely alone. Oregon's discoveries, arriving decades later with independent geological confirmation from a volcanic ash layer, gave his conclusions a second, harder voice. Once that timeline cracked, evidence from elsewhere on the continent stopped looking like isolated anomalies and started forming a pattern. At White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico, researchers working the dried bed of ancient Lake Otero identified dozens of human footprints pressed into gypsum sediment, including tracks small enough to belong to children, some appearing to move at a running pace. Radiocarbon dating of seeds from spiral ditchgrass found in the same sediment layers, published in 2021, placed the prints between roughly 21,000 and 23,000 years old. Critics raised a legitimate concern that the seeds could have absorbed older carbon from groundwater, skewing the results. Follow-up research using conifer pollen, which does not carry that contamination risk, returned the same range. A third study published in Science Advances in 2025 used organic material from wetland and lake sediments as a further independent check, and again the results landed in the same window. 3 separate methods, 3 separate materials, 1 consistent answer, placing people in New Mexico during the height of the last ice age, walking alongside Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths on a shoreline the old model insisted no human had ever reached. Then there is California, where the evidence stretches so far back it barely resembles the same conversation. In 1992, a freeway construction crew near San Diego uncovered the partial remains of a mastodon while grading soil for a new roadway. What paleontologists found upon closer examination was not a simple fossil deposit, but a scene bearing clear signs of deliberate processing. The bones displayed spiral fracture patterns, breaks that only occur in fresh bone rather than bone that has already fossilized and turned brittle, consistent with someone cracking them open to access marrow. Scattered among the remains were several large stone cobbles, too heavy to have been carried there by water, apparently used as hammerstones and anvils. Uranium-thorium dating of the bone, conducted by a team that included Stephen Holen, Kathleen Holen, Thomas Demir, and Richard Fuligar, returned a result of approximately 130,700 years old. The findings were published in Nature in 2017. And the number alone placed the site so far outside conventional timelines that much of the field has simply avoided engaging with it. The date predates even the widely accepted timeline for modern humans spreading out of Africa, meaning that whoever processed those bones in California was likely not Homo sapiens at all, and not Neanderthal either, but some other, unnamed branch of the human family present in North America more than 100,000 years before any other confirmed evidence on the continent. All of this eventually circles back to a single question that Oregon's discoveries could not answer alone. If people were here this early, how did they actually arrive, since the frozen land corridor out of Siberia was supposedly the only door? That assumption depended on the belief that ancient humans lacked the capability for open water travel. Research on the island of Crete complicates that belief considerably. Crete has been geographically isolated by open sea for roughly 5 million years, meaning anyone who reached it had to cross open water deliberately. A team led by archaeologist Thomas Strasser identified stone tools at Cretan sites dated between roughly 130,000 and 700,000 years old, resembling technology associated with Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus, both predating modern humans by a wide margin. If those populations were capable of crossing open Mediterranean water that early, the assumption that boats were a late, sophisticated invention starts to collapse. Genetic research supports a parallel picture along the Pacific. Studies tracing the mitochondrial lineage known as D4H3A have followed its path to the northern coast of China, suggesting two separate waves of migration into the Americas rather than one. The earlier wave, estimated at around 26,000 years ago, likely followed the Pacific coastline by boat, moving gradually from East Asia through a chain of temporary coastal settlements rather than a single dramatic crossing. A second, later wave, around 15,000 years ago, took the interior land route across Beringia, and this is the group most closely tied to the Clovis-era population, the culture long credited as first. Under this model, the people celebrated for generations as the original discoverers of the Americas were, in fact, comparatively recent arrivals to a continent that had already been explored and settled by others thousands of years earlier, people who came by sea rather than by ice. What Oregon did was force a reckoning that had been building for decades. A dried fragment of human waste in a desert cave, and a worn stone knife buried under volcanic ash 70 miles away, gave the field something it could no longer simply set aside: physical evidence tied to hard, independently verifiable dating methods, corroborated by DNA in one case and a volcanic eruption in the other. Together they turned Meadowcroft from an outlier into an early warning, turned White Sands from a curiosity into a confirmation, and placed the Cerutti Mastodon Site's impossible date into a landscape where, suddenly, impossible dates were becoming the norm rather than the exception. None of this erases the achievements or the reality of the Clovis people, whose distinctive fluted points remain some of the most sophisticated tools of the ancient world. What it does is restore the people who came before them, populations whose names we will likely never know, whose descendants nonetheless carry their genetic signature into the present day. They were not a failed experiment or a footnote. They survived the retreat of the glaciers, the reshaping of coastlines, and thousands of years most of us will never be able to fully picture, and their story sat quietly in the dirt of an Oregon cave for over 14,000 years, waiting for someone patient enough, and humble enough, to dig one layer deeper than everyone before them assumed was necessary. That is, in the end, the real discovery. Not just a date, but a reminder that the earliest chapters of human history are still being written by the people willing to keep looking long after everyone else has decided the story is already finished.